the release of Commanding Heights for Global Transportation. Thank you so much for joining us. SAFE, for those who do not know us, is an organization founded to advance transformative transportation technology to increase energy security and reduce oil dependence. We were founded in 2004 and quickly came together with leading retired military leaders and business executives to educate on the threat of oil dependence to US economic and national security, and have been involved in this debate ever since. As leading advocates for the electrification of transportation and supporters of new connected transportation technology and business models, we grew increasingly concerned about the risks to the US from China controlling the markets and supply chains. We started working on this paper and its recommendations over a year ago, and we look forward to working hard like we have in the past with previous recommendations to ensure that this report is understood widely and implemented by US policy makers. I want to thank SAFE team for all their hard work, Jeff Gerlach and Ron Minsk on the policy team, Goran Wokade and Guido Enfien for organizing this event, Alex Adams for the PR, and Alex Hutkin and Ladine Freemuth, who have worked on the Hill. I also want to thank our 3 Energy Security Leadership Council members who are here today with us. The ESLC is the backbone of SAFE. It's their tireless work and dedication to this country that makes them such a powerful voice. We'll hear from Admiral Dennis Blair, the chairman of SAFE and former commander of the Pacific Command, then Adam Goldstein, former vice chair of Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. And then after I present our report and recommendations, from General Jim Conway, the 34th Commandant of the Marine Corps. Both Adam and General Conway serve as co-chairs of our Energy Security Leadership Council. You're welcome to submit any questions at any time in the YouTube chat box, and keep the conversation going on Twitter using the hashtag #TranspoHeights. Okay, Admiral Blair, take it away.
Well, again, thanks very much, Robbie. Can you hear me now? Okay, I come at issues like energy and transportation from a national security perspective. And I have a pretty simple definition of national security. We're secure when our foreign enemies or our competitors cannot jerk us around. It's really as simple as that. The best armed forces in the world play an important role in our national security because in the end, enemies don't jerk us around because we can make them pay. But too often, we don't take timely actions here at home to make us secure in the future. We allow vulnerabilities to develop because of short-term incentives, short-term thinking. And over time, those vulnerabilities become so severe that we have to use our military and other forms of national power to compensate for things we should have done here at home long ago. So in the past, we allowed oil-producing countries to jerk us around because our transportation sector was over 90% dependent on oil. We had to use our armed forces, our diplomacy to ensure an adequate supply of affordable energy during inevitable supply shortages. Things have changed. Now we have a prospect of many more electric vehicles coming into our fleet. Electricity as a fuel source is domestic, it's inexpensive, it's stable. And when this happens, and it's happening faster and faster every day, we'll be much more secure from OPEC plus. Saudi Arabia, Russia, and their buddies in that organization will not be able to jerk us around. But in the process, we risk forming a new national security vulnerability. China has jumped ahead in the race to dominate the international electric vehicle industry and the international supply chains that provide the essential components of those vehicles, battery components, other rare earth metals. And China has gained this lead, partly, it's true, by admirable hard work, but also by many illegal and unfair mercantilist practices. And if the United States just thinks short term, as we did originally on oil, China's dominance will soon hollow out the American automobile industry. There will be business and job losses in one of the largest and most important sectors of the American economy. We will lose the manufacturing sector, the largest manufacturing sector in the country, the sector that was the arsenal of democracy in World War II, and more recently was turned to building ventilators so that we would have enough in our hospitals to deal with COVID-19. But more important to me than these bad effects is that, left unchecked, this trend will allow China to jack us around, to jerk us around. Or put a little bit more elegantly, it will concede a very powerful and dangerous lever to a country that makes no secret of its ambitions to displace the United States as the world's most powerful country. But we can change this picture. We can control our destiny. We can deny China that leverage. And that's what the recommendations of this report that we released today are all about. We'll discuss them in detail over the next couple of hours. And to start that, let me turn now to Adam Goldstein, who's the co-chair of the Energy Security Leadership Coalition, and his day job is the global chairman of the Cruise Line International Association. Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Blair. It's a privilege to speak on this topic today. Frankly, it's been a privilege to serve on the Energy Security Leadership Council for the last 15 years. The original reason for me to join the ESLC, and frankly for business leaders to be involved, was the amazing destruction of economic value that oil price volatility, particularly spikes up in those days, wreaked on the economic performance and security of the United States. As you've heard, with 90% of the transportation sector dependent on oil. And as a company, having been in a sector, being in a sector that is a heavy transportation provider, we felt the injury to our business model. And not only we, but spikes upward in oil price reliably produced recessions in the United States going back 100 years. Of course, remarkable changes have happened since 2005, not least of which is that the United States somewhat unexpectedly became the world's largest oil producer. And yet, if anything, it seems there has been more volatility since then, not less. And not only have we been concerned about spikes up like we were 15 years ago, we've now become concerned about spikes down in the oil price in terms of its effect on our domestic oil and gas industry. And we've also become, of course, much, much more cognizant of the environmental impacts of the dependency on oil as a fuel source. So today's reasons for being involved on behalf of business include the original reasons, but they also include a sense of tremendous opportunity. If we can make the adjustments that Admiral Blair was talking about, we have opportunity geopolitically, economically, militarily, and environmentally to improve the future trajectory of our country. But as he said, we cannot exchange a dependency on Middle Eastern countries for oil to a dependency on China and others for the electric vehicle supply chain. And businesses and the country need to do very important risk mitigation, generally in terms of national and economic security, but also very specifically in terms of the country's innovation and research and development capabilities that are often supported and spearheaded by the automotive sector. From a business sensibility, when you're facing short-term disruptions and possible long-term declines in competitiveness, you develop strategies and you take actions, provided, of course, that what is happening matters. And there can be very little doubt that what is happening in this area matters to this country. We are still the world's largest consumer of oil, again, highlighted by the transportation sector, which consumes 70% of the nation's oil requirement. There is still a world oil price that, even with us being the #1 producer, we cannot control. No country can control, except for maybe the OPEC plus countries who try. The automotive sector that Admiral Blair talked about, that today sustains 10 million American jobs, has in each of 24 states more than 100,000 automotive jobs, needs to be preserved. And the world is moving, whether anyone likes it or not, to a digitized, electrified future. That is a challenge. That is also the opportunity, as I mentioned, and it needs to be seized. The role of batteries and motors and other components have become increasingly critical, and you've heard and you will continue to hear today that China is aggressively moving across the entire terrain to seize advantage. So it definitely matters, and the United States needs to raise its game. Thank you, and Robbie, back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Admiral Blair. Soon again. Thank you to General Conway. I have some slides that we'll be using. Hold on one second. Great. Oil dependence has been a malignant problem for the US since the 1970s, when we woke up to the issue. As you have heard, it has driven or constrained much of our foreign policy since then, and its volatility has significantly impacted our economy. It is the dependence on a single transportation fuel, as Admiral Blair said, one that is traded and priced on a manipulated market, that is the defining point of this dependence. And it's why SAFE has advocated, as you heard, for diversifying fuel sources into the transportation sector, including a focus on electrification. EVs have 4 characteristics that meet the criteria we believe make it important to national security. There are diverse and domestic fuel sources to produce electricity. The prices for electricity are stable, and there is a national infrastructure for electricity that can serve the backbone of refueling. SAFE is always assessing new technologies and business models, and we are not just tied to one, we are mission-driven, and we currently see a convergence of 4 technologies that are creating a revolution in transportation: telecommunications, battery technology, sensors, and big data. As you can see, or not, in this graphic, connected, autonomous, shared, and electric are attributes that can be force multipliers, reinforcing and accelerating each other. It is this consumer proposition which fundamentally changes transportation and thus accelerates change. Cars and trucks in the future are going to be electric, connected, and likely autonomous. China, in its Made in China 2025 strategy, has clearly seen this change and smartly and deliberately taking control of its critical parts of the supply chain and is looking to dominate the auto and transportation sector. This should concern us all. The automobile industry has been the foundation of our industrial base. There are over 10 million direct and indirect jobs in the auto industry, and over 1 million jobs in the truck manufacturing sector. The Commanding Heights of Global Transportation we are issuing today addresses this question with recommendation that accelerates the United States in this race, because we're currently behind China, Asia, and Europe. As one battery analyst said to the United States Senate, we are in the midst of a global battery arms race in which the United States is presently a bystander. We offer a minerals to market strategy because that is the only way this will work. If we do not develop a strong EV market, it will be difficult to build a world-class vehicle manufacturing sector and secure control of the supply chain. We have to develop an ecosystem. If we only focus on the development of vehicles, we risk losing millions of jobs in car, truck, and battery facilities, and also giving strategic leverage over supply chains to other countries. So I'm going to spend a few minutes walking through the components of the electric vehicle recommendations, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about the policies on AVs, connectivity, and 5G. Clearly, when you read the report, you'll get a much more detailed listing of all the recommendations. The electric car and its battery are pretty simple, and this is one reason that China has chosen not to focus on competing with the US and our Western allies on internal combustion engine cars. Our 100-year head start makes it difficult for China to catch up. The internal combustion engine has as many as 2,000 parts, while the electric vehicle is pretty simple, with essentially just a battery and a motor. We need to focus on 1, minerals, both rare earth and critical minerals; 2, processing and refining of those minerals; 3, battery components like the anodes, the cathodes, battery cells; 4, permanent magnets for the motors; and 5, manufacturing the vehicles in the United States. We face different challenges with rare earth minerals and other critical minerals. See, rare earth minerals are not really rare, but are used in very small amounts and are found in very low concentrations in the earth everywhere. They are used for permanent magnets for motors and other high-tech equipment with defense and non-defense products. The critical minerals are found in much higher concentrations and are used in larger quantities in the manufacturing of EVs and batteries. These include nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite. The policies will be different for each type of mineral. China currently mines more than half of rare earth minerals, but processes nearly 90%. Even the rare earth minerals mined in the US today are actually sent to China for processing. The US can and should encourage mines like Mountain Pass in California, but must also really focus on processing. We propose a policy that promotes a rare earth processing cooperative that will be owned by the companies that consume the rare earth mineral. The cooperative will have guaranteed customers and an incentive to operate efficiently. We can use tailings from other mines in the US like Florida or other mines with rare earth itself. A single private company cannot do this because China will undercut their price. China can do this because it is cheaper to process it in China due to more lax environmental and labor standards. China is not looking to maximize profit in this sector, but to maximize control over this market. It should be noted that Beijing itself is estimated that would cost them $5.5 billion in just one province in China to remediate the environmental damage from rare earth mineral processing. We need policies like antitrust exemptions to allow the users of minerals to work together as a cooperative. The other minerals I mentioned, lithium, graphite, nickel, and cobalt, are in the US in different quantities, and it's a different issue. The US must allow for this mining of these minerals. It takes 2 to 3 years to open a mine in Canada or Australia, and 10 years on average in the United States, if ever. The environmental community needs to recognize that devices that consume renewable energy often cannot themselves be made from renewable resources. We need these resources to build the EVs, the battery storage that can clean up transportation and enable a renewable grid. We must have high environmental standards, but then lean towards securing this part of the supply chain. The Commanding Heights offers policies in this process. We also need to be focused on recycling and new battery chemistries. The minerals in batteries could be used over and over again if recycled. Think about this. Unlike oil and fossil fuels that get depleted when burned, minerals can be recovered from used batteries and used in new batteries over and over again. Though a battery degrades, a battery made from recycled minerals is as good as new. So we need to focus on recycling. We could end dependence on new foreign minerals and never face a supply threat once we have all the minerals and resources in the batteries for our entire car park, and then just use them over and over again. We propose a code on each battery pack, making it easier to know what is inside for recycling, and tax credits to promote this recycling as this industry gets ready with the first generation of batteries being taken out of cars. We can have a closed loop system, and we should strive for that. And finally, we need to continue to invest the R&D in new chemistries that could both improve the performance of the batteries and lessen our dependence on these minerals that are not found in the US. For instance, solid state batteries are more like microprocessors, which the US is very good at manufacturing. So this can help us leapfrog other countries. We then need to focus on the component parts of these batteries, from anodes to cathodes to battery cells to battery packs, and finally the permanent magnets. The percentage of these components that are made in China is astounding. China produces more than 60% of the cathodes, 80% of the anodes. Further, China manufactures more than 70% of global lithium-ion battery cells compared to less than 10% in the United States. We need batteries and motors to be manufactured in the United States, whether by American or foreign companies from allied nations. We offer a range of tax credits and loan guarantees to help our auto and truck manufacturing industry retool. Several of these programs currently exist but have not been fully used. We also recommend expanding these programs to medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as to components for autonomous vehicles, like sensors. However, this supply chain requires a domestic market, or the supply chains and the technology will be developed somewhere else, closer to where the market actually exists. If the leading market is developing somewhere else, that R&D will be invested somewhere else, and the improvement one gets by manufacturing and learning by doing will happen somewhere else, not in the United States. This is an ecosystem, as I said, that starts by having the leading market. from which the US we do not possess. We must give up our ideological predispositions and support the market itself. Currently, the US supports EVs in a very limited fashion and only for cars. We need to think broader to all vehicle classes. While most internal combustion vehicles, diesel and gasoline, have unique parts and core components and batteries are the same, no matter what type of vehicle they go into. So it is important to foster both the car and the truck market, as they both consume the same battery components and can share manufacturing infrastructure. In fact, it may be easier to work with companies and fleets rather than individual consumers. China has more than 500,000 electric buses compared to just 1,000 in the United States. These buses help build a massive battery industry in China. We recommend that we reform the $7,500 EV tax credit so there's no longer a per manufacturer cap. We need to sell lots of EVs to build an upstream supply chain, and we should not limit those sales. It should be sunsetted because the government should not support it forever. In addition, we need to add a tax credit for medium and heavy duty vehicles. These larger vehicles will require more battery cells, so fewer vehicles will help jumpstart this battery supply chain. We should also add money to the no-low grant programs and other grant programs to help public transit and public agencies transition. We should be using our support of public fleets more wisely so we get these national security benefits. I now want to transition to AVs and connected vehicles that are likely to be supported by 5G. We recommend that the US both set a regulatory pathway for these vehicles to create the certainty for companies that are spending billions of dollars on research, development, and now some deployment. The Chinese government can do this by fiat. We need to move faster and offer regulatory clarity. In addition, we should allow companies to build up to 100,000 vehicles that are as safe as current vehicles, but have different designs. The entire value of AVs, including environmental gains that can be achieved, come when we have different types of vehicles. Vehicles that can be purpose-built, which takes out weight and saves fuel. Car companies currently can only build 2,500 cars with novel designs, but it's not enough for companies to truly rethink and retool as they get started. We need companies like Cruise, who is trying to build an entirely new type of vehicle. Neuro and FedEx are trying to rethink contactless delivery to our homes to make the United States the country in which they develop and deploy. The 5G issue is well-trod ground, and I'll not spend too much time talking about it, but clearly we need to be sure that we have a secure network, which is for our increasingly connected vehicles so that they can operate and that privacy is ensured. We should continue to allow the auto industry to keep its spectrum for safety. Other countries are operating in this spectrum, and we should not needlessly relinquish it now as we stand on the cusp of this transition. Finally, the auto industry has not only been the key to our industrial economy in the US, but also to our allied countries like Germany, France, Korea, and Japan. We need to work together to address the common challenges. So we propose a forum where automakers can interact with one another on these challenges related to supply chains in China without fear of antitrust issues. The US created the modern day car industry when the first Ford Model T rolled off the assembly line in 1908. And as you heard, the auto industry was the key to the US winning World War II as the arsenal of democracy, and now was recently mobilized, again, retooling to make the ventilators as the arsenal of health. We need bipartisan mineral to markets approach to make sure we have a strong industry, leading technology with good paying jobs for whatever challenges may lay ahead for the United States. Thank you. And I can take some questions if there are any. So we were waiting for Congressman Swalwell, who is going to join us. So let's do something a little different here. Let's go to General Conway, 34th Commandant of the Marine Corps, co-chair of our Energy Security Leadership Council, to share some words with us now that you've heard the highlights of the report.
Thanks, Robbie. In 2010, when I was still on active duty, I commissioned a group of very talented guys and gals at Quantico to take a look at the world order during the period 2020 to 2025 and to tell me what it would look like. The obvious purpose was to understand how the Marine Corps could best support national policy during that period. They came away with a very interesting paper and some prescient observations, the most memorable of which was that they said by 2025, we would no longer have a single polar world, such as we had after the wall fell in 1989, but rather a multipolar world with Russia, China, the collective power of the Europeans, the United States, and the new player on the scene, India, all exerting influence. They said it would be toughest on the United States, on us, to make the adjustments in that new relationship amongst nations. My folks made the assumption that China would play by the international rules that govern powerful nations. Unfortunately, that has proved not to be the case. China was welcomed into the WTO in 2001 on hopes that she would become a powerful trading partner. Instead, we now know that China has been engaged in what I call Machiavellian warfare against Western nations, particularly the United States. In all phases that governed international relationships, economic, military, environmental, and geopolitical, I view that their policies have been deceitful, two-faced, cunning, and unscrupulous. China has fostered a 100-year plan, a 2030 plan, and multiple 5-year plans, all of which have one thing in common, that the end invariably justifies the means. Over the past decade, we've watched China lose an international courts battle to the Philippines only to ignore the findings. We have seen them declare sovereignty over great swaths of space and sea space and land space in the South China Sea with no authority to do so. And most recently, they have broken a 50-year deal with the UK on how Hong Kong would be governed before they got halfway through the process. On the economic front, for the last decade, we've watched China lure Western business into their country on the promise of access to that great market, only to have their state policies co-opt Western business practice and spend the time attempting to thieve their IP. And now COVID. The conscious spread of that terrible disease represents the boldest and, in my mind, the most irresponsible action ever by a foreign government. The international jury certainly still remains out on how it will be resolved, but I believe that there must be a reckoning. Admiral Yamamoto remarked famously in 1941 that his country had awakened a sleeping giant. Today, the giant is not sleeping, but it is distracted by internal bickering and partisan divide. Complacency and the associated rose-colored glasses that go with it have allowed a national security threat to once again loom large in the Asia Pacific. A collection of policies to counter the Chinese economic and military threat, to include the attempted seizure of future transportation systems, in my mind, is simply not enough. The most vitriolic of the Chinese leadership do not accept the United States and Western nations as competitors, but instead they view us as the enemy towards their long-term plans. In that context, it's my belief that the U.S. must also develop a national plan to deal with this Chinese threat to our national security. The plan must have economic, military, environmental, and geographic components. It must include partners and ally nations that see the threat the same way that we do. The plan must be bipartisan and not subject to elections every 2 or 4 years. And maybe most importantly, the plan needs to be based on a clear-eyed understanding of the Chinese and who they are and what they represent to us over the coming decades. I would argue at this point that my people in 2010 got it wrong. It's not the United States in 2020 that must make the difficult adjustments, because ominously, nowhere in the multiple Chinese communist plans for the future is there an emphasis on a multipolar world. Denny, back over to you.
I'm afraid we have a change in our schedule because Congresswoman Dingell, who was supposed to meet with us just now, has been called off to a meeting with Speaker Pelosi is called. We can imagine what the topic is, so she won't be able to talk with us now. I was lucky enough to talk with her last week on another panel which sort of set up this program. She calls herself the car gal. She is the member of Congress who's been associated with the automobile industry for years and years, runs in the family, and she had a lot of good insights to offer to us. She has been a real champion on offering bipartisan legislation that runs exactly towards the goals that we are advocating in our report. Things like national regulatory regimes so that manufacturers have certainty. Things like the subsidies and tax credits to encourage innovation by smaller automobile firms, and a bunch of the recommendations that are in our report. She has been working in the same direction. So we're sorry to miss her, but we certainly look forward to her being a champion of the sort of approach that we recommend in this report in the upcoming Congress, where, as General Conway said, we really need some good bipartisan action that will withstand turnovers in leadership and that will provide the sort of consistent, steady policies that this country needs for the competition that we are embarked in, and the sort of persistent long-term effort that we need. So
Admiral Blair, we have Congressman Swalwell, who's standing outside the Capitol. I think we can go to him. I feel like I'm on the beach. I'm standing here in the streets before Congressman Swalwell gets attacked. Anyways, Congressman Swalwell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Robbie. Of course, thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, SAFE, for inviting me. And just to echo the Admiral's sentiment, I'm encouraged that on this issue of critical materials and critical elements as it relates to our national security, that Congress is starting to understand the problem, and partnerships are being forged. I say that because just moments ago, I launched the Critical Materials Caucus in Congress, where Guy Reschenthaler from Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, and myself from the Bay Area, two people who have very different congressional districts, come from different congressional politics, see an opportunity on this issue to work together, recognizing that if we don't, the only winner is not a Democrat or a Republican, it's China. And so to counter China's edge on 80% of the market in critical materials, we need partnership and unity as an antidote to that. I'm also motivated by my own constituents. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Sandia Laboratory are both in my district, and Livermore is a critical materials institute, a part of the DOE program, and so they will benefit from action on this. And then yesterday, we had debate on the floor, and we're voting today on a critical materials package that is a part of an effort I've been leading since 2013. So I welcome this partnership to work with you, and would like to demonstrate bipartisan efforts in the future in working with SAFE. So I'm encouraged. 40 days out to an election, it's very tense in the country right now, but on this issue, I promise you, Republicans and Democrats, starting with Guy and myself, are working together.
That's wonderful, Congressman Swalwell. Do you have like a second for a question?
Yes. Go ahead.
I have to say you've set up the best shot. I think you've done this before because the Capitol is perfectly behind you. I do want to say that I can't hear you through your mask, but that would just be inappropriate. I'm joking around. I was joking. I don't know what that's like. So my question is, we are offering a minerals to markets plan, right? Like the idea that Democrats support EVs and other technology, but don't really think about how to get the supply chain here and the markets. And then Republicans talk a lot about, critical minerals. Like, how do we bring that together? That's what we care about. We think this is an ecosystem. Do you think that's possible? in
Yeah.
the next Congress.
Robbie, I do, and I really like the idea of, as natural gas, disrupts the coal markets, and obviously energy standards put pressure, on coal. And I think about, coal workers and making sure that they still have dignity of work, and that, their mines, could be harvested or reclaimed in ways that address this, critical elements need in our country. I see that as an opportunity where, Democrats and Republicans typically clash over coal, but, what if, we found ways to make sure that, you could mine it and address other national security needs. And so I want to be a part of, those types of opportunities and partnerships. And I'll never be someone who just says, let that coal worker, lose their job. They're in a dirty industry. No, I see the mine as an opportunity, as you pointed out, and also making sure that, you have long-term jobs in those industries.
Well, we look forward to working with you and hoping that you can bring this minerals to markets message, that it's in all parts of the supply chain, to the Democratic caucus, and we'll work as hard as we can with your colleagues there, and then on the other side to convince them that they should provide incentives for electric vehicles and the regulatory certainty for other technologies like autonomy.
Great. Well, thank you guys, and please be in touch and let us know how I can help.
Be safe. Thank you so much. I should have always joined CNN. So we're on to our next. Part. We have Dan Yergin. Dan, are you there? Are you available? I think you unmute. Okay. Great.
I'm now unmuted.
Great. So let me introduce Dan Yergin. He is a man who clearly needs no introduction, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of The Prize, which is, unlike A Brief History of Time, a book everyone has on their coffee table that they've actually read. And he's out with a new book called The New Map. And The New Map is Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. And I encourage everyone to go buy it. I think many of the things are very analytical. But the stories he tells of how we got here are very much, I think, in line with the way we're thinking. I also would like to say that Dan wrote another book besides The Prize and this great book, The Quest, as well as The Commanding Heights. So I thank you, Dan, for letting us steal it from, I think it was Stalin or Lenin first, and now from you. So I appreciate you letting us steal the title. So Dan's going to share with us some remarks about the new book, about the energy landscape we're in, and then we'll be able to take some questions. So please do send in some questions. We want this to be interactive. I know it's hard with Zoom, but we think this is a great opportunity to talk to a luminary in this space. Okay, Dan.
Thank you very much, Robbie. And of course, I'm thrilled to be at a conference called The Commanding Heights of Transportation. And thank you for using the title. It does come to us from Lenin through the British Labour Party, the Indian Congress Party, through my book, The Commanding Heights, to SAFE and Robble Diamond. So it has a great fraternity there. I presume you've already expressed your thanks to Governor Gavin Newsom for doing that advanced publicity and promotion for the conference today. It was so well timed, and I'm sure it was strategized like that. And I am very pleased to be here. I've known SAFE really from the beginning and know what really important work it does, both in terms of policy and research and bringing them together and advancing the discussion. And you've certainly done that with this new study, The Commanding Heights of Transportation, to which I, many congratulations on the work and the timeliness of it. And it fits into the themes of the new map, which talks about, and the new map is the new map of energy and geopolitics, how they come together. And there's been this tendency for geopolitics to be over there and energy transition over there, but now they've come together, and they've come together in your study, and they're coming together in the world themselves because of the shifts that are going on. And so I think the study is a real contribution. The energy transition, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and transportation. The energy transition is the scale of it is, I think, sometimes not taken into account. If you wanted to really go all wind and solar, to meet sort of goals that are out there, you would have to add twice as much capacity as the entire current electric power generating industry throughout the entire world. And that would involve a lot of minerals, a lot of mining. It would move us into an era in the new map that I call an era of big shovels, because so much is there. And of course, that ties in with what you're focused on. The other thing about the scale of the energy transition is that, we had an $87 trillion economy before COVID, and that economy ran 84% on fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. So it's not something that you can just shift quickly, but the direction is clear. And one thing that SAFE is focused on from the beginning, and that I go back to again and again, is that so much of energy security is about diversification, of not being overly reliant in any direction. And Robbie and I were talking about a line that I have from Winston Churchill in the prize, actually, where he was talking about Britain making that big decision to convert its battleships from coal to oil before the First World War. And people said, you're going to rely on oil and from a country called Persia, now known as Iran. And Churchill said something that I think is really the byword of energy security. He said, safety lies in variety and variety alone, diversification. And I think what this study is about, and what SAFE has been about, is diversifying transportation sector in particular to build security and resilience into it. In the new map, I lay out a vision that I think is not so far from what SAFE sees. I call it the new triad. And my book is divided into different, quote, maps. And the term map is really metaphorical. But America's map, China's map, Russia's map, but roadmap to the future. And it's really the new triad, I call it, because it's really three things coming together, which SAFE has focused on for some time. One are EVs, electric vehicles. And it is striking that at this point in time, half the world's EVs are in China. And China, more than any other country, has made a commitment to it. And I think there's multiple reasons for it. Certainly, one is urban pollution. Behind that's climate, but I think it's really urban pollution. Secondly, is dependence on imported oil, and that's rising. And 75% of China's oil is imported, and a good part of it to a part of the world that Admiral Blair knows very well, the South China Sea and through the Malacca Straits. And in the book, I quote former Chinese president talking about the Malacca dilemma depending upon it. And I think there's a third reason for the Chinese commitment to EVs, which is the word leapfrog. They're not going to be able to catch, they have the world's largest automobile market by far. And in all the discussion of decoupling, kind of lose sight how important the Chinese market is to American companies. But in terms of leapfrogging, they're not going to catch up and be a global competitor with the internal combustion engine. They can buy Volvo and other things, but they're not going to be at the forefront part of the fleet at this point. But you take EVs, combine it with the second thing, which is ride hailing, which has obviously taken a hit during COVID, but we'll come back. And then third is autonomous vehicles. Although I noticed when one of the great people, I talked to many people really in the thick of things for the book. One of them, Sebastian Thrun, who was led Google's entry into what became Waymo. And by the way, there's a great picture of him in the book, in the new map, when they won one of the prizes for autonomous vehicles. He calls them self-driving cars. But you take the three of them together, and you have a different kind of auto industry, presumably over times. It's one in which software becomes a much more fundamental to running these whole systems of self-driving electric taxis, basically, that pick people up. And so I posit in the book that big oil may be succeeded by something else, which will be called big mobility. And who knows, maybe big mobility will be a target of congressional investigations in 10 or 12 years. But that's what's happening on the energy side. I would say that there has, until this study work we're doing called the new supply chains for a zero carbon future, there's been not much attention to the nature of the supply chains. But I think that now that's happening as we see the growing tension in the relationship with China. In the book, I describe what I call the WTO consensus. It's kind of a term I invented to describe the state of mind from the end of the 1990s, beginning of 2000 when China joined the WTO, to about, I think different people on this call may have different views of it, but I think it really predates the Trump administration, a sense that that WTO consensus was coming undone on the US side because of things like the South China Sea, but also about intellectual property and the growing sense of a technology race, which has come to the fore. And that WTO consensus is clearly today given away to something else called a strategic rivalry or great power competition. You know that those words have echoes of earlier eras that ended quite badly. But it's not, it's already a question, is it really becoming a new Cold War, or is there going to be a Cold War? Well, it's going to be a lot more complicated than the Soviet-American Cold War, which was really based upon nuclear weapons. Here you have the two largest, and by the way, the Soviet Union was not a very important factor in the world economy, actually. Here you have the two largest economies in the world that have, their growing differences. And I think the last few months have really accelerated that. And yet at the same time are much more interconnected than people recognize. I think many people would be surprised to know in their 401k plans or their pension plans, they're Chinese companies. And we've seen kind of the unraveling of some of that, the question of Chinese students in the United States. I think the Wuhan, the virus that began in Wuhan has, if you say, what are the consequences of it? We can point to what it means for transportation, for commuting, for digitalization, but it also has accentuated the split and the tensions between the United States and China. We're not seeing a cooperative approach. So it is very, it's going to be very difficult, I think, period, to get it right. But I think, I think what this study's done and other things, it just said, there are issues around the supply chains that you need to be aware of. I noticed the EU came out with a report. The EU has very advanced goals for net zero carbon by 2050, not very clear of how to get there. And I think they've just sort of looked at the supply chains and have to look at what the cost would be, particularly in a post-COVID era when governments have such staggering levels of debate. But challenge, and I think this is an important contribution and it's an important discussion to how to manage the supply chains at a time when rivalry is growing greater, and do so, manage them in a way that promotes stability rather than accentuating tensions, that reduces the potential for tensions. And at the same time, I think a very big issue, maybe the most important geopolitical question of the 21st century is how do you manage the geopolitical relationships between China and the United States? Thank you.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. You were at our first event when we did our first oil shockwave, and here you are. So you were at the launch of the Electrification Coalition. So I really do appreciate all the intellectual guidance you've provided us. I have a couple questions, some from the audience, some from me. My first question is regarding conversations you've had about electric vehicles inside, let's say, oil companies or countries that sell a lot of oil. You have the luxury, the ability to talk to massive oil companies, countries that most of their revenue comes from oil. So I'd be curious, has their view of EVs changed over, and what flipped that, if it did flip from it's a joke to something that they basically are serious about?
Well, I think it's the recognition that there was a pre-Paris and the post-Paris eras in energy, and the way it's being adopted by governments, by investors, and by companies themselves. So I think if you look at European companies and you look at what BP has said, they want to shift from hydrocarbons to being more electricity. They talk about their charging business and so forth. So that's in one direction. You know, obviously people probably don't know this. The lithium ion battery was really invented in an Exxon laboratory in 1976 when it thought the world was going to run out of oil and you needed to sort of move in this direction. And there had been a previous boomlet in EVs that faded when oil prices came down. But I think that over the last 2 years, you know, it's seen that this is just more, the world is moving in this direction. At IHS Markit, we estimate, we have a big automotive research group, several hundred people. And at this point, the assumption is we go from 1.4 billion cars today to about 2 billion in 2050. About 1/3 of them will be EVs, which means that still 1.3, 1.4 will still be gasoline because cars stay on the road a long time, 12 years. But by 2050, 60 to 80% of new cars being sold will be electric vehicles. And the push that's coming from the automobile companies, the pressure that the EU, I have in the new map describing what the European Union is doing in terms of the penalties that will be imposed on automobile companies that do not move towards low carbon vehicles. So, but then that does get into the question about what are the supply chains, what's going to be the availability of resources. But I think that, and among oil exporting countries, I think some in the Middle East see it more vividly. I had a piece a week and a half ago in the Wall Street Journal about energy security, and it began with the CEO of an Middle East oil company stopping in Washington, and we met over on 24th Street for coffee. And he didn't want to talk about Iran. He didn't want to talk about the price of oil. He wanted to talk about how many Teslas he'd seen in California. So I think the mental map is changing, and you know, people are looking at the price of Tesla stock and saying, what's it telling you about the future?
Thank you. I have a question about peak demand. You know, when we first met, people were talking about peak supply, and now I think you were one of the first to talk about peak demand. And that BP's recent analysis showing that automation and solar and electrification drives this even faster. Just do you believe it's already occurred? And,
no.
And what's
no.
the?
Well,
what's the
I think it's too soon to generalize when we're still in COVID as to what changes. Some changes we know are very clear in terms of digitalization. And I think that BP is probably, there may be people from BP on this call, influenced by the change in work behavior, you know, the sense that people are going to work at home. I think BP's announced that some significant number of its employees will work at home. There'll be less commuting. But if you look at their scenarios, there's one that shows a very sharp fall, one that shows somewhat of a fall, and one that shows it sort of kind of moderating out over time. And I think we're still in the world of trying to assess the scenarios. The one that got the most attention that said, you know, it's already peaked and or will peak in the next couple of years. I think I would still conceptually just still use the view that I have in the new map that probably the peak is in the first half of the 2030s. And then it slides down, it doesn't plummet down. Also, by the way, oil is used for a lot of other things like, you know, the tools that put stents into people's hearts and, you know, and plastics and so forth, which have kind of their value has been reinforced by their role in helping to manage the crisis in terms of health.
Dan, I have two more questions, and then we're going to turn to Congressman Curtis, who's sitting in our green room. My first question is from the audience as well. Do you have any perspective on the difference between Japan in the 80s and our fears of what they are doing versus now we're all talking about China, clearly our reports on China. And is this just the same old, or is China different? Like, how do you see the similarities or the differences? Or
well, there are some, I haven't thought about some superficial similarities. There was a book that was published by a Harvard professor in the late 80s called Japan as number one. When it got published in Japan, it was translated as Japan is number one. And that kind of rang the bell because then they just started their decline. But there, when they bought Rockefeller Center, everybody said this is the end, they're going to take over. It turned out it was a really bad real estate deal for Japan. I think this is different because that was there was the fear of technology and imports, of course, and Japanese cars, but there wasn't the sense that, Japan was still an ally. Here now, that the coming apart of the WTO consensus, Hong Kong, a whole host of other things have accentuated, and there's always a question of Taiwan. So I think the scale of this, there's some superficial similarities, but I think, nobody looked at Japan in the late 1980s and saw it as a geopolitical rival, trying to create its own order. You didn't have China and Japan and Russia coming together, where you now have China and Russia coming together. So I think the differences are more significant than the similarities. But I think the one thing is that, we should have confidence in ourselves and not go into a panic, but rather understand the situation and what do we do about it. And I think that's one of the things your study is trying to convey.
You're an expert in oil markets and oil history. I'm curious what you think about, when we started and we first met, oil supplies were going down, imports are going up. That's totally changes in your book, talking about the fracking revolution. In fact, that's where you start. But at the same time, we still have the exact volatility we've had before at a global price. And I think it's safe. We've, labored a long time saying, yeah, it's good for balance of payments, but we're still, and as Adam Goldstein said before, we see it on the upside and the downside now, which is even worse, when prices are high and low. Just what's your sense of what is oil dependence? Like, is Russia and Saudi Arabia more oil dependent than us because that's where their revenue from?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that we saw this spring when oil prices went to zero, kind of a president who said, I always hated OPEC, realized that actually this is a pretty important sector of the economy. When oil prices used to go down, it was great for the United States because we were importing most of our oil. It meant money stayed in this economy and it was like a tax cut. But now you have this, something like 2/3 of fixed business investment was part of the shale revolution, very important for manufacturing in the Midwest, very important for our balance of payment, very important for job creation. So in a sense, we are both, as a leading consumer and as a leading producer of oil in the world, we're kind of on both sides of the street and, trying to assess what's the overall impact on the economy. But we have certainly kind of flexibility that Russia and Saudi Arabia don't in terms of our oil production. But, it's quite striking. When we started, Robbie, U.S. was importing 60% of its oil. Now the U.S. is still the world's #1 oil producer. This happened very fast. Shale was a really disruptive technology. I don't think it's going to be disruptive in the future because I think it's now, unless something very dramatic happens, it will continue to be part of the world oil market. And sometimes when I hear people say we should ban fracking, I stop and say, well, can you tell me the next sentence? The next sentence is if you ban fracking, it means the United States is going to import a lot more oil and do it quickly because the production will go down. And we have 280 million cars that at this point, about 279 million of them run on gasoline. So I really don't, I actually scratch my head and say, why is that a good policy? If it would get you back to where we were when you started this about the risk of dependence on imported oil.
Right. The beauty of electric vehicles and of the United States and the wealth we have both in, minerals, but also oil and gas is, we have the ability to have electric vehicles and have a diverse domestic fuel source into our transportation system, never have to worry about that price. But at the same time, we could export it or we could use it for producing that electricity. So that, it makes no sense not to want to move to this. Norway has been the greatest example of that. Right here in Norway, has this largest, most wealthiest sovereign wealth fund in the world, making it from oil, but also the lowest carbon emissions per molecule because.
Sure. Well, of course, two things about Norway. One is they produce electricity with hydro, which they probably could not build those plants today. The other thing, so I asked one senior Norwegian kind of why, I mean, they've had about the most generous incentives for EVs. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because we're a rich country. They decided they wanted to do it and they have the resources, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and they have 4 million people. Gives you a lot of flexibility.
But one could say that they now have more ability to export that oil to make more money, right?
Yes, that's
less
right.
home and export it. So to me, that's really the strategy of the United States. Use less of our oil at home, export more of it, and use electric vehicles, which both get us to those goals of security as well as better balance of payments. So Dan, I think we're going to go. The first 4 people to email our info at our website, secureenergy.org, and get a free book. Send us your name and your address. I have one more pitch for Dan because I love being a pitch man. CIRA, which is the largest energy conference in the world that's down in Houston. You no longer need to go down to Houston thanks to COVID. You can attend it online from March 1st to March 5th. So I'll join. I hope you'll buy the book, and thank you, Dan, for everything.
And I want to just tell people also, the pictures are great. I would tell you this is the only book on energy that has a picture of Jackie Chan in it. But all I'll say, it's connected to the Belt and Road strategy, but I won't say anything more. So anyway, Rob, it's great to be part of this, and congratulations to you and your colleagues, all who are involved in this important study.
Thank you so much, Dan. We'll catch you on the flip side. Moving on. I think we're moving on to Congressman Curtis, who's going to be introduced by General Conway. And as we heard from General Conway's first comments, hold on to your seats. He's a man who doesn't pull a punch. He's all in. So I don't know if the screens have changed.
Thanks, Robbie. And thank you, Congressman John Curtis, for spending some time with us today. Just a quick few comments of introduction for the audience. Congressman Curtis comes to us from the Utah 3rd District. He's been in the National Congress since 2017 when he replaced a guy named Jason Chavis that you might have heard of. He started out life as a small businessman, but had 2 very successful tours. We call them tours, sir, as the mayor of Provo, which I think catapulted him onto the national scene. He's a family man. He and his wife Sue have 6 children and 7 grandchildren, and most recently has become a member of the Republican China Task Force. And it's in that capacity that he joins us today to offer some observations and take a few questions. So thank you, sir, for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you. I might just mention they're voting now, and at some point you're going to see somebody walk in that door and come grab me by the collar. But we're going to take full advantage of the time until they do that.
Well, thanks, sir. Appreciate that heads up, and we'll get into it therefore, and hopefully we can have you for at least most of the period. What I didn't mention about the congressman's background is that uniquely, I think amongst Americans, he spent 2 years in Chinese culture and speaks some level of Mandarin Chinese. And sir, sort of spinning off that personal experience for the first question, what is your overall view as it currently exists with regard to the U.S.-Chinese relationship? Just a few bullets, if you will.
Well, it's not healthy. I think that's just very, very clear. And if it's not clear to Americans, we need to do a better job of articulating that. It's a relationship we need to be healthy. We need a strong relationship with China. We need to get this corrected and get on course. We can't ignore the fact that they're such a dominant force in the world. But right now, it's a relationship on life support.
Okay, good. Sir, not all Republican congressmen have chosen to join the China Task Force. Can you tell us what prompted you to think that it was something you wanted to do?
Well, to be frank, it's a real honor. There are only 15 of us, and it was by invitation. Kevin McCarthy invited us to be on it. And I think most who are not on it actually have a little bit of envy. It's been a great experience. For a number of months, we've held as many as 3 or 4 or more briefings per week, some of them classified. and have gone really deep down into the weeds on this issue.
Okay, well, perhaps because it is somewhat operating in a classified vein, I don't think the American public knows a lot about it at this point. Can you share with us some of the objectives that the task force has in mind?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think not only American people, but many members of Congress don't understand all the working pieces here. And I would just say overall, this is a relationship which decades ago, we decided we wanted to help bring China up to a standard, a higher standard. And we made concessions towards that, as we have with many countries. And we did it with the assumption that they would move to better human rights and to more freedom. And that's been done. That model worked in Taiwan. It's worked in many places around the world. And unfortunately, we find ourselves today in a situation where human rights abuses are actually worse. Freedom is worse than it was when we started this. And China has not responded the way that we would have hoped that they would respond.
Well, I agree with you, sir, and it's got us in a quandary with regard to where to from here. It's interesting that at this point it is the Republican China Task Force, not the congressional. I realize we're in the silly season, but do you see bipartisan support, or you see the other side joining you post-election?
Well, you're very insightful. We must make it bipartisan. We will fail if we don't make it bipartisan. When the recommendation comes out, we're just a few days away. You'll see many Democrats' bills recommended in that. We've tried very hard to make this a bipartisan effort, and I think even in our findings, we've tried to stay away from a political pandering or taking a grandstanding. And like I say, you'll actually see bills that have been entered by Democrats that we're going to recommend. And I'm hoping that they'll come and join us. We get past the silly season. We really need them to be part of this effort.
Well, that's a great response, sir, and I hope you're right. I mean, I think it's the only way that we ultimately succeed. Sir, you lived aboard in the Chinese orbit, and there's something to be said for a whole of nation approach, but China sort of takes it to the next level. How do you see that whole of nation approach when it comes to competition with Western business and Western society?
We're really starting at a disadvantage. Imagine a corporation who had every agency on their board, who could waive any regulation that they wanted to waive, who could avoid taxation, who if they needed more money, could just open up a faucet. And that's what we're competing with. And because we're better, we usually beat them. But we start at a disadvantage, and we can't assume that we'll always be able to prevail.
Roger. Sir, you mentioned the classified nature of what you're doing, and I don't want to get you in trouble, but are there any observations you can share with us that have maybe been eye-opening or surprising to you as a result of your collective efforts?
This is certainly not classified, but I think it's very important when we have any discussion about China to differentiate between the Chinese people and the communist Chinese leadership. I love the Chinese people. They're great people. I love the Chinese culture. You mentioned I spent time over there and speak Mandarin, and these are great people. And I want to make sure that we don't do anything that would indicate we have any problem with them at all. But their leadership is not. Their leadership is authoritarian. It's repressive, and it seeks to take away freedom. And I think that's the kind of the aha moment here. I think for us that have been involved is, what we don't have friends in their leadership right now, and we can't take that lightly.
Sir, you mentioned something that I think we see the president wrestling with today, and that is how do you walk that balance beam? I mean, on the one hand, I think we cannot continue to accept some of the things that you've described. On the other hand, you don't want to crash and burn a relationship. So it's a balance beam that I think we have to walk as a nation, arguably as a world. But what are going to be your recommendations to him in terms of how he negotiates that potential minefield? Well,
I don't want to be too political, but I personally believe it takes a Trump personality to deal with China. I was very critical, to be honest, of President Trump early on with the tariffs, but he saw something I couldn't see. right? And he knew we had to rip this Band-Aid off, that we were too dependent on this trade relationship that was so one-sided and that we've been taking advantage of for so long. And so I think as we deal with China, we've got to remember that the ultimate end is a good relationship. This is not about severing a relationship and pretending that we can get along. It's not a divorce, let's put it that way, right? It's mending a relationship, and it's putting things in place that make sure we're not taken advantage of in this relationship, that it's an equal relationship with partners, that with fair competition. And I'll take competition all day long. And if we get beat, we get beat. But you can't put us at such a huge disadvantage. You can't ask our corporations to hand over their technology. You can't, right? I mean, you can't, it's got to be a different relationship than we've enjoyed.
I like that answer. And I have a follow-on question, sir. Again, going back to your experiences in the Chinese culture. When I visited there in 2009, the senior officer in the embassy told us that the Chinese will talk win-win, but they don't necessarily believe it. What you just described, I think most of us could, accept as a win-win relationship and the way to go. But do you have optimism that we can get them there?
So they actually have terminology for a win-win relationship that you could translate as we win, you lose, right? And that's their definition of a win-win relationship.
Interesting.
And as Americans, we truly seek after that win-win. And you can look at our relationship with many countries around the globe where it has been win-win. As we've lifted them, as we've worked with them, it has benefited us. And we've operated under that assumption for way too long that China truly was seeking a win-win relationship. And the reality, again, and here again, I'm talking about their leadership, not the Chinese people. They don't want a win-win. They want a China wins and dominates the rest of the world and the United States.
I fear you're right, and that makes it sort of a scary proposition. Sir, to the topic that we're dealing with today, and that's the future transportation systems. The Chinese, I think, very, very wisely have stolen a march on us, realizing they can't compete with the combustion engine, but they can certainly compete with the electrical vehicles, and in many ways it facilitates their society. What are your thoughts on what we see them doing, and is it so far gone that we're going to have a very difficult time catching up and competing in that arena?
Well, we are behind, but I truly believe we can not only catch up, but we can dominate. If we unleash American ingenuity and creativity, if we don't overregulate or overtax, and that's what we have to be careful of. We've got to remember, who we're competing with. And our industries that are burgeoning and our car manufacturers, we've just got to be really careful that we don't put a situation together that causes them to fail, because this is an area where it's not acceptable to fail. Think about for a minute if the Chinese had been the first to develop the internet, and we had to live by their rules on the internet, and that's what we're facing here. If the Chinese do dominate this marketplace, and we're now adapting to their standards and their rules, it's not a place we want to be in as a United States. And fortunately, we've got great minds, we've got great companies, we've got great resources behind it, and we just need to make sure that we take off the ball and chain and let them go.
That's a great transition to the next question, Congressman. I mean, a lot of these minerals that are going to be required are out west. And I'd be curious how you see government endorsement of what must be done. Is it best at the federal level, the state, or the local level? How do you see us trying to get on this catch-up mode and enhancing our own future with the transportation systems?
Well, I think you mentioned the critical minerals, and I would refer to a bill we call HR 7061 that helps us catch up. Right now, we have many of these critical minerals. We're just not accessing them. Somehow we rationalized in our mind it's okay for them to rape and pillage the environment, and then we'll use those. But it's not okay for us to carefully mine these right here in the United States with good standards and safety standards and environmental standards and use those. And we've got to do some right sizing on that. I would also mention another category would be the 5G technology and spectrum And we've got to get our act together in that as well, and make sure that the U.S. is not inhibited by lack of spectrum, or that we're over-regulating 5G and not letting them be successful with 5G.
You know, we have such a federal system that invests powers in the states. And of course, everyone's concerned about the safety of advanced vehicles and EVs and those manner of things. Do you think that in some cases that we can be our own worst enemy with overregulation? And if you do sense that, how do we sort of implement a national policy or national strategy that will allow progress?
Yes, I do think we make a mistake here. As a former mayor, let me just tell you that if I accepted $1 of federal money on a road project, but my project increased in cost by 30% because of duplicative regulations, not regulations that were a problem if I didn't do, like safety or environment, but they were duplicative, and it increased the cost of a project. We talk about an infrastructure bill here in the United States. I could reduce the cost of infrastructure by 30% in an instant, simply by letting states regulate and not the federal government on that one thing alone. And so, yes, you see, we do have a problem here, and we do have a habitual desire to overregulate here in DC. And that's not to say we should avoid safety regulation and environmental regulation. It's just simply to say that regulations that duplicate, that are meant to keep people from getting out of the gate to begin with, we've got to take a really hard look at those.
Sir, is that a legislative function of the Congress, or is that the Department of Transportation, or how do we get there?
I'm smiling because everything about Washington, D.C., whether it's legislative or administrative, wants to regulate, wants to be bigger, wants to control. I'll tell you, as a mayor, mayors can do things better than states, and states can do things better than the federal government. Now, there are notable exceptions to that. And sometimes, right, we need regulations that span state lines. And so it's not an all-inclusive thing. But generally speaking, our most powerful work is done by local government.
Sir, I don't know if you heard previous conversation on this teleconference or not, but previous speakers have really emphasized the incredible importance of the automotive industry to our nation and to the economy. It seems that we are at somewhat of an inflection point. I mean, we're going to have gas vehicles for a long, long time to come. But at the same time, this whole concept of EV and AVs is out there more and more. Do you see a need sort of at the congressional level to dedicate some thought to the future success of this industry and to the jobs and the criticality to the economy that it provides?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. We have a role to play here. Some of that role is getting out of the way, and some of that role is incentivizing. And some of that role is, quite frankly, regulation. We just have to be careful with that. But we need to do our part here, as well as everybody else who has a role in the success of this. Okay,
great. You said everyone else, and that leads me to think external to our own borders. I think in a lot of cases, our partners and allies, our friends across the globe see it the same way. Is it the intent of the task force to reach out to some of those nations and see if we can find common cause?
It is, and I've been pleased. We've had briefings from other countries as part of this task force, and the message seems to be we're getting it. We may not have got it to begin with, but we're starting to get it. COVID had a lot to do with that. COVID opened a lot of people's eyes as to the real intentions of China, and it scared a lot of countries. And I think it's helped our allies rally with us and realize that they need to work with us on this. Ultimately, we need them to be successful. And, one quick example is our trading relationships with other countries. As you know, the new NAFTA, heavy emphasis was the automobile industry and getting that correct. And a healthy trading relationship with Canada and Mexico is paramount to us being able to put China in the right place as far as our trade relationship. A healthy relationship with the European Union and our other great allies around the globe is really very critical. And to make sure that they're on the same page as we are with right-sizing our relationship with China is very, very important.
Great. Do you see that hopefully in the future the bipartisan task force would reach out, or is that a State Department function? Or
I'm smiling.
I understand how that works, sir. Thanks for your time. Great responses. Very prompt and precise responses. Great to have you as part of the program.
Well, you know the drill. The first one is she comes in about that far, and in about 2.5 minutes, she comes in.
We don't want to see you get grabbed by the nape of the neck. So
if it wasn't a vote, I would ignore her. But because it's a vote, I truly need to run. Thank you for letting me be with you today. Hope everything goes well for all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Robbie, back over to you.
Thank you, General Conway. We have provided such good live TV for all of our viewers. We've had congressmen pulled out, congressmen standing on the steps of the House, and some that don't show up. So it's all great. Well, we're up to our next panel. I don't know if we're going to call everyone up here. Greg. Perfect. That's exciting. Our Brady Bunch look. So this is the view from industry, and we've got such a great panel. I'm joined here by Andy Leland, Head of Strategic Advisory for Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Benchmark has really taken the world and Washington by storm by being the vocal number crunchers around the world about mineral and battery production. So we're very excited to hear from Andy. Edwin Olson, Chief Executive Officer and founder of May Mobility. Ed founded May in January 2017. The company operates 25 electric autonomous shuttles in 3 cities. And to date, May Mobility has logged over 250,000 revenue-generating miles. Ed participated in the famous DARPA Grand Challenge, which you heard about from Dan Yergin, when he was a student at MIT. Ryan Popple is the co-founder and executive director of Proterra, which is the leading innovator of zero-emission battery electric buses in the United States. He was an early employee of Tesla and a member of Kleiner Perkins, and he notably served our country in the U.S. Army. And finally, Michael Stumo, CEO, Coalition for a Prosperous America. CPA, Coalition for a Prosperous America, is a national organization working on policies to balance U.S. trade, create jobs, achieve broadly shared prosperity. CPA represents 4.1 million households through its associations and company members in agriculture, manufacturing, and labor. Thank you all for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. Why don't we start with Michael? You know, we heard from Dan Yergin before in his book that he talks about a new Cold War with China. It's focused on EVs, new energy technology. Maybe can you give us some perspective on China's whole of government approach, which has been mentioned several times, and how they use that to compete, and why you believe industrial strategy is actually an important component for the United States when competing with China?
Sure. Thanks, Robbie. It's a great program here. China's whole of government approach is because it's by nature, they're a state-managed economy. It's not state capitalism. It's not a reasonable facsimile of our capitalist model. It is a state-managed economy. Prices don't matter. Costs don't matter. If something is directed to be done, achieving GDP targets must be done, or the provincial leaders will face sanctions by Beijing. We can't think of them as some sort of an economy that's just in a transition stage waiting to be a market economy. So they've had 5-year plans for many, many years. And now, of course, they have China 2025, which has electric vehicles on it. That will happen, or people will get punished. And they will put the money into that sector, and they'll reduce taxes, VAT taxes, or they'll reduce taxes. They'll give land, they'll give buildings, whatever, but the production targets will be met, and they'll sell it somewhere for some price. That's just how it's worked in steel. It's worked in other sectors. It's how it's worked in, LED technology or other technology. So we have to really we can't think of level playing field. They're in it to win. And for our side, we need to develop a strategy to win. They have printed more money to pump up the economy than we've ever seen in the history of the world. In fact, if you remember the money printing debate after the Great Recession, saying we're going to debase our currency, but yet the U.S. and the European Central Bank, ECB, and Japan printed more money than anyone thought was possible. Well, you combine all that and double it, and that's how much China prints. So the People's Bank of China prints new renminbi. They capitalize the state-owned banks, which then lend to the state-owned or state-supported enterprises, which then build bridges to nowhere or unoccupied cities, or other what we would call non-productive investments, or some productive, of course. And they can't pay the loans back, and the PCOB prints more renminbi, recapitalizes the state-owned banks, and retires the debt of the state enterprises. So there's that, and there's China's currency undervaluation, which they've done for a while, not so much now, but the dollar's about 27% overvalued, which makes it hard for us to compete. So there's, number one, we've got to have incentives to build here. Number two, we've got to have a customer base. And number three, we've got to have protection from foreign predation. So that's what it takes, I think.
That's great, Michael. Thank you so much for setting that stage. Andy, your colleague Simon Morris testified in Congress that, as I said in my opening remarks, we're in the midst of a global battery arms race in which the United States is presently a bystander. It was one of those amazing slides that passed by every viewer every second for like 5 minutes. Seeing that we have a technical glitch. Seeing that you're an expert in the mineral processing and component parts of batteries, can you share what he meant by that and how you believe this is a threat to the U.S., auto and truck manufacturing, and maybe the industrial base fully?
Yeah, so since 2014, Benchmark's been tracking the build out of the global lithium ion supply chain, not just in terms of cell manufacturing, but the chemicals, cathode, anode, extraction technologies. And what we've really seen with, some sort of increasing alarm is just how quickly China has grown to become the global leader and to really consolidate its position all across that supply chain. And, when we started tracking this back in 2015, there were 3 plants planned around the world to be producing at a gigawatt hour scale. By the time you went to press on your report, it was 140. Skip forward a month and we're at 167. So it's absolutely phenomenal how quickly the industry is building out. If we look at where the US is in comparison to Europe and China, by 2024, the US will have about 9 of these plants in operation and be producing about 144 gigawatt hours of cells, or at least have capacity to do that. By contrast, the European Union will have 16 plants at 256 gigawatt hours, so almost double that. And China will have over 100 at 1,350 gigawatt hours. So they're going to maintain that 70% part of the supply chain. And the US is on track at the moment to have about 10% of the global market share. If you're the US, you really, given the size of the economy, you don't want to be 10% of anything, particularly not an industry as important as lithium ion, because it really is an enabling technology, not just for EVs, but for many other sectors. And, has been mentioned, their national security implications from not being a technological leader in these breakthrough technologies. You mentioned the threat that not sort of being at the forefront of this or keeping at the forefront of this could be. Well, as these supply chains ramp up, as we move more and more to electric vehicles, you have to understand that your existing supply chains are ramping down. So what does that mean? It means you're having factory closures. It means you're losing jobs in the Midwest. For states such as Ohio and Georgia, who have huge automotive component manufacturing capabilities, those industries won't exist unless they adapt. So, there needs to be a plan here, because otherwise what you're doing is you are winding down a large part of your economy and effectively shipping those jobs again to China, to Asia. So there really does need to be a bit more of a strategy and a holistic strategy, as we've discussed before. I think from the US to really seize the opportunity that lithium ion presents.
But you said it's also not just a EV story, that it's also a bunch of larger stories. To share that, like the larger maybe economic and other industries that are impacted.
Yeah, so the obvious one is the renewable energy sector and energy storage systems, as we say. Effectively, this allows you to have decentralized grids, which are far more secure. It allows you to have a cleaner energy mix. If you look at what Elon Musk announced a couple of days ago, they want Tesla to be producing 50% batteries for EVs, but 50% batteries for energy storage systems. You can also use those cells in a variety of applications, particularly with industry, anything where you are effectively sometimes consuming a lot of energy and other times not so much. It makes sense to have a battery to even out the load. And there are many, many industries that will benefit from that, and just being able to store energy and being able to store energy, as I say, off of very expensive and vulnerable grid systems. So I think the key thing really for the way that electric vehicles are impacting the world, electric vehicles themselves, they're not going to have a huge impact on climate. They're very expensive to produce. They have a very high carbon footprint in the manufacturing stage. But what they've done is they've massively brought down the cost of energy storage. And that has huge implications for both internal combustion supply chain, but also the oil and gas sector and the wider energy economy. So as I say, once you have cheap energy storage, it really does open up a huge world of opportunity.
So Ryan, before we get to China, let's just, you ran a big bus company that was trying to create an electric bus. Give us some perspective on batteries and prices and where we are and where the United States fits, and maybe some of your frustrations in trying to build this up in the United States.
Sure. I think this is a competition or a comparison between entrepreneurship and private capital markets and a classic economic system versus a command economy. And so I think what everyone experiences outside of China is that you're basically pitting innovation against unlimited but often wastefully deployed resources. So I think my perspective, having been at both Tesla and Proterra and invested in a number of clean energy companies, is that the U.S. is the world leader in terms of rapid innovation, getting to the right technology. I think making that technology compete in an open market, which gets you to the most competitive overall solution. But there isn't a recognition of the scale and the capacity that needs to back that up. So I think Tesla's Battery Day is a perfect example of the level of innovation that comes out of the private sector in the US. But immediately the question goes to, can we supply the raw materials for that new type of battery? Can even Tesla keep up with it, with what will be organic demand for its cars and for its energy storage? If there was a way to provide scaling capital to U.S. innovation, I think it would be a significant leveling of the playing field. And the last thing I'd add is, while the U.S. is a very large market, fundamentally the way the EV market currently works is that US-based companies compete with each other and with Chinese companies for US market share, whereas Chinese companies are predominantly given a specific piece of market share. So there's sort of a protected home playing field. So just structurally, no matter how good a technology company is in the US, its addressable market is smaller because it really can't realistically go into China which is the largest market in the world for a lot of these technologies, and it faces that imported technology in its home market.
Ryan, that's great. I guess, Michael, do you have any comments to add to either Ryan or what Andy just said about this just broader competition?
I think they summed it up pretty well. I don't have much more to add unless you have another question, I guess.
No, let me move to anyone who wants this one, but we're proposing this minerals to markets idea, this holistic approach. Maybe we'll start with Andy. How important is the holistic approach? Does the United States need to control every aspect of this supply chain? Are there more important aspects that we should be thinking about?
Yeah. So there are 5 key stages in lithium-ion supply chain. You've got the extraction of the raw material, the chemical processing, the anode and cathode manufacture, the cell manufacture, and then the application. If you don't have the middle stages, it kind of defeats the point of having the earlier stages or even having the latter stages. And what we quite often see in lithium ion is people sort of focus a lot on the word lithium, and they say, well, okay, we will produce lithium and then we'll produce batteries. And they miss out the middle of the supply chain. The middle of that supply chain is still in Asia. And if you don't think holistically, you're going to end up with a situation like you have with rare earths, where you've opened up, a great resource in California, or reopened a great resource in California, but don't have the processing. So you have to ship it to China. Now, that means that China can put a 20% export tariff on overnight. It means that they can just stop exporting or put a quota on, and they've done this in other markets before. And there was 0 point in doing it. So you need to make sure that you do have every stage of that supply chain if you're going to avoid the supply chain risk and localization risks. And actually, if you look at where the US is at the moment, you have the application, you have the big automotive industry. You still don't have enough cell capacity, but we expect there will be more plans. There's almost 0 cathode capacity, and there's very little planned. It was great that Tesla actually announced a cathode plant, because they are the sort of US domestic champion in this supply chain at the moment. Again, chemical processing, something that needs to be built out. And if you don't have all of that, there's actually not much point producing the lithium from a national security perspective.
Robbie,
sorry, Brian.
I was just going to add, I think there's such a phenomenal opportunity for a transition from a 20th century industry into a 21st century clean energy economy. When you think about that entire supply chain, we have analog industries, and we have engineering talent and research talent and factory capacity. We have existing industries that basically provide those skill sets for the petroleum industry, from extraction to refining to storage. And I think we know the future of mobility is the electric drive. It is 4 or 5 times more energy efficient than an internal combustion engine. And the price of all of the components in electric vehicles has dropped below the forecasted level, where we know that transition starts occurring just for economic reasons. So we know, as you've said, the cars of the future are going to run on digital electric powertrains. The buses, the regional trucking, all these applications are going to go distributed energy with solar storing energy in batteries. So now the question is, are we going to use that industry to create an economic boom in the United States the way we did with petroleum and automobiles a century ago? But I do think we have the ability to mine, we have the ability to refine, we have a massive chemical industry, petrochemical industry, but we've got to think about what is it going to take to get all of those pieces of the petroleum value chain transferred into the EV value chain. So I guess my point is, we have these skill sets, they're just currently deployed in the last century's industry.
If I could add to that, Robbie, do you mind?
No, please.
Yeah. So there's there's four of the big industries in any advanced economy are automotive, aerospace, defense, and shipbuilding. We've lost shipbuilding mostly. We've deindustrialized many different sectors by not paying attention and thinking the service economy was our future. But automotive is a huge employer, and we really, as Ryan said, we really need to. We have a lot of capacity that will go unutilized in the automotive supply chain, and as Andy mentioned, having the different parts of the supply chain is very important. Having it global leaves you vulnerable in many types of supply chains. And indeed, supply chains do want to localize. Even look at Silicon Valley. They could be anywhere, but they tend to be in that area. But it is in the national interest to spend, to do a whole of government, as we said, approach to preserve and to advance these supply chains so we keep ahead in automotive, we keep in aerospace, we keep in defense, we keep these big sectors that absorb a lot of labor, absorb a lot of capital, spin off a lot of innovation, and and give birth to future generations, 1, 2, 3, 4 future generations of industry. Once you let that industry go, you get no more industry. The future tech from that industry is gone forever. It's very hard to get it back. So it's extremely important.
Let me turn to Ed for a moment, and we'll talk about AVs and telecommunication networks. But why don't we start by maybe speaking about, and please feel free to describe May Mobility if you'd like, but really describe the combination between AVs and EVs and why these go together. As an organization, I'm commonly asked, why do you care about autonomous vehicles, and why do you care about 5G now? Your mission was to end oil dependence for economic and national security, and suddenly talking about driverless cars. So maybe share some perspective and bring that into this conversation of EVs.
Yeah, thank you. I got started building robo-taxis and started talking to city transportation planners who I thought would be the customers. And what they pointed out is that cities are being crushed by their own transportation systems. You can go to almost any city in the world and look out the window, and what you'll see is congestion that's slowing down the economy, slowing down people getting to work, not just people who wear suits, but people who are cooking meals and are in the service industry. And the problem is so bad that in Manhattan, for example, you've got the average speed of a taxi at about 4.7 miles per hour. So, it can actually be faster to get out and walk. That's how bad the roads are. And that stems from poor utilization of the roadway that we have. And we can't build our way out of this problem. We can't go into the middle of an urban core and double the number of lanes. So the question really comes from an economic growth perspective. How do you get more value, how do you extract more value creation out of the road infrastructure that you've got? And the answer is not going to be taxis. It's not going to be robo-taxis either. It's going to be small shared vehicles that can get people where they want to go quickly, safely, and something that they're all going to like to use. Now, the challenge here is that doing this economically means they have to be autonomous. The economics just don't work to build a transportation system on that scale that can operate at that level of efficiency without those vehicles being autonomous. So we got to work about 4 years ago building autonomous shuttles, deploying them around the country, and learning how they can transform the way that people get around cities. And what this will ultimately allow us to do is to change the way cities are physically built, replace those large parking structures, which are incredibly costly. And oh my God, someone's calling me. That's not cool.
It's a customer. It's a customer.
Yeah, it's probably a customer. All right, we'll just hide this. Good grief, stop. All right, party foul on here.
It makes me feel like I want to wake up in the morning, so that's my alarm.
Right, so the challenge ultimately comes down to how can you improve the flow of people and goods through cities, and it is about doing it efficiently, and that requires autonomous vehicles.
So let's talk about this EV-AV nexus. Many environmental community are very concerned that vehicle miles traveled will go up with autonomous vehicles. And, you know, will they be EVs or will they be internal combustion engines that just run autonomously and create more pollution? What is your view on why they will be EVs? Is it just government fiat, or is there a technical or business reason for this in your mind as you created May Mobility?
Yeah, I think there's two really great questions in there. The first one is about what happens if passenger miles go up. And I would say, in short, that's good. There's a huge latent demand to move people and to move goods. And if we can serve that in a way, make better use of our infrastructure to do that, that is a win. That's going to drive the economy. It's going to help businesses grow. It means more customers for restaurants. So the question is not how can we put the brakes on that? How can we get people and goods where they need to go quickly and easily, safely? On the other question, which is what's the connection between AVs, autonomous vehicles, and electric vehicles? At face value, nothing. We built our first generations of autonomous vehicles on internal combustion engine vehicles. We've built the second generation on hybrid vehicles. But you dig a little bit deeper, and the cities really care about electric vehicles. In these highly congested areas, the smog pollution is a huge issue for them. And they want to deploy transportation systems that are going to help clean the air and be perceived as part of the forward-looking view for that city.
Well, thanks for the answer and the insight. Ryan, we just heard cities want cleaner air. I guess one of the positive things we discovered in COVID is that by taking a lot of cars off the road, we remembered what it was like to breathe. But maybe electric vehicles allow us to do both, breathe and move. So you work a lot with cities and you're trying to sell them electric buses. Maybe share your perspective on working with those cities.
Well, we've found that there's basically universal interest at the regional level to move away from internal combustion engine systems, and that's a local air quality reason primarily. And as you said, during COVID, we had the opportunity to see what life was like without a massive output of internal combustion engine pollution. There's a synergy between electric vehicles and grid storage that you don't see on the internal combustion engine side. And we see this in particular for assets like school buses. So Proterra builds buses for city transit systems, but it's also a drivetrain provider for partner companies like Daimler who market an electric school bus. The interesting thing about an electric school bus is when it's not being used to move children, it's in some cases up to a 200 kilowatt hour battery pack that can store solar and wind energy when there's excess production and there's not necessarily immediately available demand. So there's an entire ecosystem that fits really nicely together, especially at the city level. If you have an aspiration to get to 100% renewable energy, and you also want to clean up your local air, and those systems fit really nicely together in a way that internal combustion engines don't. The other thing is noise pollution. Internal combustion engines, we've gotten used to them, but they are very, very noisy, especially for cities. So it's a significantly higher quality of life for residents who are near a transit system. And the energy savings, the physics of it can't be denied. You're moving a heavy duty vehicle in an urban environment, whether it's an autonomous vehicle like May Mobility, or it's a driven vehicle. You're moving a vehicle with about 20% of the energy you previously used. So it's a massive amount of economic productivity.
So in my opening remarks, I discussed the idea that both light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles had very similar parts. And, you see in China that they have 500,000 electric buses, and here we only have 1,000. And that really it doesn't really matter if it's light duty or heavy duty. In fact, heavy duty might be easier to drive that whole supply chain. I don't know if Andy or Ryan or Ed, whoever wants to speak to this idea of, in the United States, we've really only had a $7,500 tax credit. We've had some low no grants. But we really haven't focused on how you could use big vehicles to drive the massive amounts of batteries. So maybe share, is that true? And how do you see those two types of vehicle classes fitting together?
Well, I definitely, at the component level, it's definitely true. I would agree with that 100%. The cells that are going into light duty EVs can be built into larger, higher voltage modules and packs for heavy duty vehicles. A heavy duty vehicle uses more battery packs and just a larger amount of energy storage. So you don't need to incentivize as many vehicles or push as many vehicles towards EV to get the same the same demand signal that you would on the car side. And I think China has demonstrated this very effectively. One of the first things they did was push or mandate the electrification of heavy duty buses and also taxis in cities. So it provided a tremendous amount of early infrastructure and demand for cells. On the motor side, I think it's similar, although I think you are starting to see heavy duty vehicles with their own bespoke drivetrains, which makes a lot of sense. And the last thing I'd point out is the charging networks can be the same, which I think is really really interesting, in that you could use truck routes, bus routes, school bus routes to basically seed a lot of the charging infrastructure. And today we actually saw a great example of U.S. entrepreneurship and private capital with ChargePoint, U.S. company, one of the largest public charging networks in the world. I think they're the 10th auto tech IPO or merger this year. So just a demonstration of the innovation and the private sector interest in the U.S. for EV.
One thing I'd just add to Ryan's comments is that, these are industries that are growing, or doubling every couple of years at the moment. It's really important to build out an entire ecosystem and get the scale that you need. And to do that, subsidizing particularly the urban transport systems is important. But it's also really, when you look at the scale of this, it is about the light vehicle market, just in terms of scale. And the more that you build that out, the greater number of component manufacturers you have for people like Ryan who are sourcing materials. It means that you can have, rather than 2 suppliers, you can have 10 suppliers, which will itself drive innovation and drive costs down. So it is really important just to have all of this happening at once because of the growth rate that we're seeing. And you need to invest into that growth rate.
Anyone else want to add anything? I remind people that we have recommended, plus and up, low, no grants for the metro systems, for public fleets using our money more smartly, as well as incentives for the first time for medium and heavy duty vehicles from the federal level. So it's something we really have seen has been a missing element of the U.S. Strategy. I guess my next question is, okay, we hear how amazing this is. Like, I want 2 of those. I don't want 1 of those. And yet we don't do that in this country. So maybe we start with Michael, which is, industrial strategy. It feels like when we say minerals to markets, you go in there to Republicans and they say, I don't want that. The free market's going to figure this one out. And then we go to, Democrats and, they don't think about the minerals, or it's something that they see as an anathema to them. I guess my question is, have you seen a change with this China question to the embracing of industrial strategy? And how have you, I guess, been working Congress and the administration?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a really big change. The wonks in Washington call it the Washington consensus, which is that that was just you just have to. It's a neoliberal efficiency free trade model, and that's that whoever God grants the comparative advantage to will win. And certainly after 1989, which the Berlin Wall fell, it was the end of history. History had shown that democratic capitalism was the model that had won. And of course, when China joined the WTO, and this week is a 20-year anniversary of the vote of China permanent normalized trade relations status, China was going to liberalize, as was said before. They were going to become more open, more democratic, more capitalistic. And instead, they have doubled down in socialism and a market-driven economy with Chinese characteristics. They've moved us to a multipolar world, which is a way station to, in their 100-year marathon approach, a unipolar world with China on top by 2049, according to Michael Pillsbury, diplomat that was around and supported Nixon's reopening to China. So we have to, industrial strategy, a lot of senators, a lot of congressmen, a lot of leaders are now seeing that, the China approach works really well. And if you look back to the US with Hamilton with his 1789 report on manufacturers, we had our own strategy with tariffs, subsidies, industrial strategy that made us the biggest economy in the world, instead of an agrarian colony serving in the other industrial powers by 1870. Germany did it under Frederick List's guidance. Japan did it. The East Asian economies did it, also with currency misalignment with industrial strategy, and now China's doing it. So if you see in the history of world development, there's no country that's gone from poor to rich under a kind of a laissez-faire free market system. They've all used industrial strategy, and China is the most recent one. And so we're seeing on the right, the Republicans have a recent heritage of sort of a Jack Kemp free markets, free trade, and freedom. And that's giving way to, wow, China's kicking our butt. And we see what's coming out with intelligence and how they are determined to win, and not to go by the rules, but to bend Western institutions to their will. And so you see Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Senator Cotton, and some others that are taking a more assertive industrial strategy view. And Rubio's pushing that in his perch as the chairman of the Small Business Committee. Seeing it on the Democratic side as well. Of course, Trump has shaken everything up because he's the change agent on trade and is using U.S. leverage where people didn't think it existed. And China has reacted badly, and President Xi has really revealed his own China first mentality. So, and we just saw yesterday or 2 days ago, the House of Representatives, by a vote of 406-3, vote to prevent any products made in whole or in part from Xinjiang province, which is where the Uyghur concentration camps are, from coming into the U.S. So that was amazing bipartisan consensus to fully prohibit items coming from a region of China with humanitarian abuses. So the increasing recognition that China is not just another competitor, and it's even more than game of great powers, but there's, being a genocidal dictatorship is just a different category. So we're seeing bipartisan change with regard to the China relationship. No matter who wins in November, there will be differences in policy between Trump and Biden, but a lot of these bells will not be unrung.
Does anyone else want to add something?
I would add that one of the best competitive advantages that we have in the United States is our educational system. That's a place where the federal government has played a large role in making investments. And that's a place we should continue to invest, because that will help us win not only today's technological battles, but also tomorrow's.
So Ed, while we're talking, maybe share some perspective on the technology of AVs, autonomous vehicles. Your fears about IP theft. We hear a lot about that. The importance of 5G networks to privacy, and why we need to worry about that, not just about where the batteries, the minerals, and the components where EVs come from.
Yeah. So control of supply chain in an AV where we want to make sure that there aren't security vulnerabilities anywhere is hugely important. One of the things that we've spoken before about was 5G and the role that plays with autonomous vehicles. And that's actually really interesting as well. It's a little bit like internal combustion engines in the sense that you don't inherently need 5G to build an autonomous car. But when you start to think about the transformation of cities that we need in order to continue to grow in these dense areas, we need to extract more and more efficiency out of those transportation systems. And that's going to require careful coordination of many cars from many different manufacturers, scheduling, routing, passenger pickups, drop-offs, and 5G can be an important part of that.
Ed, when talking about this, do you think that autonomy can accelerate EVs? Like we have talked a lot about this idea, like, EVs are driving, which is what we all know. AVs are a different value proposition. And yes, it's difficult, but once it gets out there, do you see that maybe it's not EVs lead their own revolution, but AVs help bring the EV revolution along? Because people maybe actually leave their assets, don't use the cars they have. Because like what we saw with shared cars, we saw it with Uber and Lyft. How many people left their cars in their driveways because it was actually more convenient, cheaper, and everything else? So how do you see that interrelationship between speed of EVs based on AVs?
Well, I think AVs are likely to be the laggards here, in that the technology has a long way to go in order to fully penetrate the market. And so for at least the next few years, you're likely to see AVs in relatively small quantities, probably not driving the EV industry. However, in that longer term future, the relationship between AVs and EVs becomes more important. I see that the most likely deployment of AVs is going to be as managed fleets as opposed to individually owned vehicles. And that creates a huge amount of sensitivity to total cost of ownership, reliability, maintainability, the number of parts, and driving the asset utilization as high as you can in order to recover, to be able to pay off the high capital costs of that AV and EV system. So I think at the end of the day, AVs and EVs will complement each other.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ed, for that perspective. Andy, you're sitting over there in London, and maybe bring it to that side of the pond, not over the Pacific, but over the Atlantic. And where do you see the United States stacked up against Europe? And what has Europe done right? And maybe what can the United States learn?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there is a difference when I'm talking to people in the EU Commission, they have a strategy. They know what they want to achieve from a political basis, from a political standpoint. They don't want to be reliant on China for that part of the supply chain. They want to create as many jobs as possible. And they've actually created their own competition. Like, the number of regions of Europe that get in touch with me now wanting to set up a battery hub is phenomenal. And, that's accelerated over the course of this year since the pandemic, as there has been, more stimulus money coming into Europe, which is focusing on building back different, building back greener. And, that is I think, an onus that you have in Europe, that and a sense of urgency that you have in Europe that perhaps we don't currently have in the US. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that even if you have that political strategy, this isn't China where the government will mandate things. In Europe, it is still the corporates which have to put this into play. And it's still the corporates in the US that are going to put this into play. And I think the corporates in the US are now catching up in terms of at least their thinking and their supply chain investment. And, you've seen, for example, General Motors have the joint venture with LG Chem in Lordstown, Ohio. You're going to see a lot more of that. You're going to start seeing a lot more of the automotive companies start investing in the supply chain. But what would be good is to have a bit more of a coherent federal strategy or plan, and the sort of almost a one point of contact, which the EU do have. And I'd also say that Europe, they're slightly ahead in terms of offering financial support, in terms of things like non-recourse debt capital and soft financing.
Well, you know what they say. Once the United States finally wakes up, we do things in big ways. It took us how long to help in World War II? So we'll get there. We're just trying to accelerate it from the safe ESLC perspective. Ryan, you were in the military. You and I found common cause over the messaging of national security, oil dependence. and have talked about, the politics of climate change. I guess, why do you think this got stuck, and can we unstick it?
Wow, yeah, that's a big one. I mean, I think the primary reason that it got stuck in the U.S. is for all the wonderful benefits of the private sector and the efficient allocation of resources. The fact that we have privately owned fossil fuel producing companies, I think, is the reason why there has been so much political friction in terms of dealing with pollution and climate change. If you look at, you have countries in Europe, as Andy mentioned, that are farther ahead in thinking about solving this problem, and some of those countries produce a lot of oil, but there's more of, I think, a stakeholder analysis or a sustainability view in terms of how they view their fossil fuel sector, whereas our fossil fuel sector in the U.S., our system still primarily operates to basically measuring decisions based on shareholder financial value only. And if you're a public company, that's next quarter's public results. So I try to say that without any sort of judgment or kind of moralism to it. It's just, it is a fact that we have had very large profitable companies that just mathematically are incentivized to ensure that we don't regulate fossil fuels too soon. I think the risk that we have is that if China succeeds in scaling the energy economy of the 21st century, that regardless of, I think, how controversial some elements of the Chinese production system are, they're going to have a moral authority to enter a lot of markets, especially if those markets are interested in bending the curve on CO2. So I think that the recipe is solar, batteries, EVs. That results in the lowest cost per mile, lowest cost per unit of energy, zero local pollution, and low CO2. In the US, I think this is the first year that things have really gotten local and acute in terms of climate change. And I hope that leads to better policy. And, I think in the West, the example is the wildfires. And those have burned blue and red states and are pretty frightening to see at a local level. And in the East, we have storms and hurricanes and flooding that are just unprecedented. This year, we're on to, I think, the Greek alphabet in naming new storms that are coming out of the Atlantic. So we've used up all of the English names for storms. So as you said, I'm cautiously optimistic that the U.S. will be late, but answer in a big way. But we're going to have to acknowledge that climate change is a real problem, and that if China solves that problem with an industrial system, that's going to be a highly exportable set of products, even into the U.S.
Okay, this is my last question, and everyone please be brief, or whoever wants to answer, which is, if we wanted to maintain some autonomy over this supply chain, either EV, AV, 5G, what would you do? What is the most important thing to do? Try to be a minute, maybe just provide one or two thoughts. Why don't we start with Andy?
I'd actually go back to something that Michael said in terms of, you can't just rely on the market without having, without pushing them, without having that type of industrial strategy framework. And I think, for the US, having that coherent plan and then utilizing the strength of industry to implement that and expedite that is probably the way ahead.
Michael, you were just mentioned, not in vain, but you can now say, what would you do?
Sure, you need incentives to build. You figure out what those incentives are to make the difference here, to build or to reshore. Number one. Number two, you need an immediate customer base. You can get to scale. In some cases, that means government procurement by American. And number three, you need protection from foreign predation. So the biggest foreign subsidizer of the day doesn't come in and take you out forever. And that may mean tariffs or quotas. And overarching, we've seen from the last 30, 40 years, you need a currency that's not overvalued. You need to realign the dollar by about 27%. Otherwise, it's very difficult.
Okay, Ed, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of our customers in the transportation space are cities, but their funding comes from federal government. at least in significant part. So the federal government plays a really large role in directing dollars to competitively bid projects that companies like May or Proterra can bid for. So I think that's a really important role.
Ryan, take us home.
Well, I'm a big fan of demand side.
Heat.
I'm a big fan of demand side incentives because you still allow competition. So I think that in the U.S., what you could do is combine demand side incentives, which would mean EV tax credits, programs like Low-No, funding for large fleets like UPS, FedEx, DHL to move over to EV, but then also combine those demand side incentives with local content. So you still have a free market, you still have competition, but you set a local content requirement similar to Buy America for those incentives, whether they're for cars or trucks or buses, to be utilized.
Excellent. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your insights today. You all have an amazing perspective on this issue, and we look forward to keeping in touch. And thanks for everything you've done for educating everyone on this, and I appreciate it. Let's bring back our ESLC members. Everyone, be ready. No problem. Oh, just talk. That's sad. Okay, well, let me talk by saying this is supposed to be about our path forward. So I'll go first. You know, some people say nothing can happen in Washington. We don't say that. Yeah, we don't say that. We saw fuel economy standards signed for the first time in 30 years. We made that happen and got the first fuel economy standards on heavy and medium duty trucks. People didn't think that was possible. So yes, things can happen, but we're going to make it happen. So our plan is to work hard to educate people to this problem, and then hopefully have a bill introduced in the February-March timeframe, just focused on this future of automotive, the most important industrial sector to our economy, and work with whoever is the next president to enact that in a bipartisan way and go from minerals to markets at the same time worrying about AVs and 5G. So we think it's possible. We want to work with everyone who is on this call. We think we can work with our allies around the world. We all share the similar importance of the auto industry and the truck manufacturing as the industrial base of our economies. We've given up a lot of that pie over 80 years, and we need to stop. We need to stop doing that. So I think it is possible, and we're excited to work with everyone. I don't know if everyone on the ESLC wants to share some thoughts. Why don't we start with Adam Goldstein?
So thank you, Robbie. I want to pick up on this idea that when the United States responds, it's capable of responding in a big way. I think in order for that to happen, first of all, the Energy Security Leadership Council is going to have to play an aggressive and meaningful role in its advocacy. As you know, we have a demonstrated record of impact and success, and it's a remarkable combination of business and former top military leadership. And we really have to bring this to bear in the upcoming year or two. Second is, it's hard to imagine anything big happening in the way of a positive response without bipartisan agreement on what the plan should be and how to execute against it and how to resource it. So for those of you who are on this, watching this event from either side of the aisle, we really need to work with you to look for areas of alignment and not obsess about areas of difference in order to make this happen. And the other thing I'll note is there may not be any critical moments that galvanize action in a democracy like there was in the past with oil crises and gigantic oil spikes. I think if we don't do enough fast enough, what we risk is that there's no moment of crisis until it's too late. So we really have to work together to take action before that happens, not when that happens.
Great, thank you, Adam. Let's call in the Marines. General Conway.
Thanks, Robbie. You know, we would say in the Corps that the first step in the problem-solving process is to identify the problem, and I salute you for this program and the fact that I think we've taken some important steps in doing that. I think our country has tremendous capacity to solve the problems that are in front of us, but our focus needs to be right. I honestly think that with the COVID with the election season that we find ourselves in and so forth, that our focus is too internal these days. We really need to turn off the national news and turn on the international news and realize that there's some problems out there our country faces, and that we need to take the long look. So I think what SAFE is doing is just right. I hope we continue to do it. It does seem like there's new energy in the Congress, really on both sides. I was encouraged by what Representative Swalwell had to say. And I think with the united front and the right kind of focus, we can make things happen.
So Admiral Blair just became this chairman of SAFE. Thank you for your help in running the organization. And everyone listening, if you're part of our donor group, please support. We want to launch this project in a big way. But Admiral Blair, please tell us your thoughts, closing thoughts.
Sure, Robbie. I would certainly reinforce Adam Goldstein's point about the importance of bipartisanship. The Republicans are going to have to learn to do smart regulation of the private sector. The Democrats are going to have to learn to have responsible extraction and processing of materials for supply chains done domestically. And we just have to build a bipartisan consensus that will endure our electoral cycle. The second one I'd mention is in the awareness area. I think we have to work hard to distinguish the automotive energy sector from the other challenges that China presents to us in the 10 industrial sectors that they have identified in their China 2025 policy. They're all important, but 10 million jobs, the premier manufacturing capability in this country, and the energy future stands out, I think, in a tier of importance and urgency, which we need to emphasize. I think the competition with China will get plenty of attention, and we, as we heard in the last panel, and we have to capture a lot of that attention for these really important industrial sectors that need work, and that if we don't work on them, we'll lose badly. And then I think the final thing, we have a long list of detailed recommendations. That's what we do at SAFE. That's what we do at the ESC. We try to really go through these difficult problems, and you can't make simple solutions for them. And we have a lot of detailed recommendations. But I think the one that we have to keep in mind as our real driving top priority is this idea that we have got to have a bigger EV market in the United States in order to drive everything else. We can't make any of this happen with 1 to 2% or 1 to 2 million electric vehicles out of a 250 million car fleet on the roads of the United States. We have got to build this sector until it becomes self-sustaining and brings in its train all of these other things that need to be done to make that sector safe and not have it subject to foreign influence. So those would be the three that I think that we need to just sort of keep high on our priority lists as we move forward in making this report into reality. Thanks, Robbie.
So let me close by this. Started in 2004, SAFE. There was no way to solve the problem of our economic and national security concerns related to oil. But now every technology is at our disposal, whether it be electric vehicles or whether they use hydrogen ultimately. But the idea of this fuel diversity, those vehicles are here and now and moving. And now you bring in autonomy, shared and connected. And here we can not only solve this core problem, strengthen our industrial sector, and at the same time save millions of lives on our road and provide mobility to millions of people. I mean, this is the moment that we can achieve our goals. And the most important thing, I believe, is that when we started talking about EVs, we never thought that this would become the new potential industrial and national security challenge. And we do not want to be the organization that convinced people to go to EVs or helped convince people to go to EVs, working in cities and states and the federal government, and basically from the frying pan into the fire, solving one problem to another, as Admiral Blair said in the beginning. So what's so exciting is that it's here now and we can make this happen. This isn't rocket science. Yes, it's disheartening sometimes to work in this political system, but we know that you can bring the people together when it comes to national security, and we are committed to do that. So we hope we can work with everyone who's been listening in, and we look forward to doing that. I want to finish by thanking our ESLC members, Admiral Blair, General Conway, Adam Goldstein, and everyone else who's on the ESLC and has really worked with us for all these years. General Fred Smith, who's now our Chairman Emeritus, as well as General Kelly, who unfortunately passed. I want to thank Ryan Popple and Ed and Michael. I want to thank and Andy for the panel. I want to thank Dan Yergin for continuing to educate us. And I want to thank Congressman Swalwell and Curtis for showing that maybe we can find some commonality between us. And finally, the SAFE staff that really work hard every day, and Jeff Gerlach and Ron Minsk again for writing this amazing report, as well as Gidon and Gorang for putting this on, and everyone else. So thank you very much. We look forward to Do Not Be Strangers, and we'll talk to you all soon.